Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's live streaming, guys, whether you're watching us on YouTube and on Rumble. Today, I have back Tarik Cyril Amar. He is an associate professor at Koç University. Tarik, he is a loved guest on Syriana Analysis, and he's one of the guests that I love to chit-chat with him. I feel like there is an intellectual chemistry, as we say, and also the humor of Tarik is brilliant. And today we have lots of topics to discuss together, Tarik, and I'm sure that you will love some of the news that I'm going to pass it to you to comment on. And I'm also sure that you are loving so much the war rhetoric coming from the EU officials, especially in the Baltic countries against Russia. What could go wrong, right, in this case? But first things first, we have, I believe that maybe there are two officials in Europe nowadays, the Prime Minister of Slovenia and the Prime Minister of Hungary, one of which, Viktor Orban, he was on a trip. First, he landed in Kiev. Then he flew to Moscow, and then he ended his trip in China. And after his trip, he returned back, and we watched and we heard lots of backlash about this quote unquote controversial trip. But recently, yesterday and today, I'm reading now, this is from the Euronews, they say that the European Commission has decided to boycott Hungary's 6-month presidency of the EU Council in response to Viktor Orban's controversial trips to Moscow and Beijing. They don't mention that he was in Kiev before that. Widely seen as an effort to the bloc's political unity. Then we have a member of parliaments from the European Parliament. We have 63 MEPs. They addressed the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council President Charles Michel and the European Parliament Chief Roberta Metsola, saying Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, quote, has already caused significant damage by exploiting and abusing the role of the Council presidency. And finally, we have 63 again MPs. Those are coming from Estonia, and the Estonian MP is also asking the European Union to boycott Hungary. I think the first question I would like to ask you, what does this panic tell us about the state of affairs in the EU first, and how do you see the importance of Viktor Orban's trip to these three countries?
So, first of all, Kevork, thank you very much for having me on your show again, which I also vastly enjoy every time. And also thank you for a very kind introduction. So look, this whole Orban saga, right, or Orban EU saga, I have to say, look, we live in very grim times, right? We are a bit on the verge of World War III. Global warming is absolutely in full swing already, right? We're in the middle of it. It's no longer just coming for us. We could go on, but sometimes something happens that's almost a little bit fun, right? And the EU reaction to Orban's trips is funny, if in a very, very dark and unintentional way. Of course, they try to be very serious. They take themselves very seriously, but ultimately it's very funny. Look, one reason why it's funny and not very serious is when something like this happens, I am so relieved the EU doesn't really have an army. Because imagine, they'd probably invade Hungary right now, like the Soviets, right? Like the Ursula von der Leyen doctrine would be invented, like the Brezhnev doctrine, right? You're no longer in lockstep with the EU, we're going to invade you. So they can't, right? So they're down to boycotting basically their own institutions, right? I mean, the EU is an entity that has gone from sanctioning others and being a total failure at that. Right? They basically have boosted the Russian economy by sanctioning it.
Yes.
And they've destroyed their own economies, to now essentially sanctioning internally its own institutions, which is really quite a sight to behold. And they think that this is something to boast about. So you really have to wonder what is wrong with these people, right? They're speaking to you as if we're live from the lunatic asylum right now. So here's the serious issue here, right? Orban essentially, as far as we can tell, right? Obviously, he may have had serious talks, and there may have been issues that were not shared with the public in matters like this. But essentially, what Orban seems to have done is he went on a sort of exploring trip, right? He was trying to sort of probe for options of bringing Russia and Ukraine to some sort of consensus in the future on how they could get to, at best, peace, and as a minimum to a ceasefire.
Yeah.
And Orban has been very honest while he was doing this. He was, giving himself a little bit of publicity on social media, and he has every right to do so. I think he was absolutely right, because he needs to appeal to the public over the head of these crazy elites in the EU. But he was very honest, essentially, about the fact that, as far as we know, nothing has been achieved in terms of a breakthrough, and that couldn't be expected, right?
Yeah.
This was really explorative talks. He talked to Zelensky, to the Ukrainians, to Kiev, seeing what they are willing to engage in. He did the same with the Russians, and then he did the same with the Chinese. And then finally, and I think one should add this actually to this series, he made use of his trip to the United States, ostentatiously for this NATO meeting, right, to also then talk to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And I think that is part of this series, and a very important part of the series, because as we know, Donald Trump has unofficially, but still endorsed a sort of peace plan, how to bring peace and to end this war very quickly. Orban has now come back, and according to the Financial Times today, Orban has actually written an official letter to other major leaders in the European Union and told him that Trump is ready to impose his plans very quickly in case he gets elected. That is, that Trump will not even wait for inauguration in January 2025. But if he gets elected, as is now, I think, very likely in November, Trump would act very, very quickly on his plan of how to make peace. And essentially what Orban seems to be telling his colleagues, his hostile colleagues in the European Union, is that, look, you have a small window of opportunity now. You have only a few months left. Either you get your act together and do something productive about this finally, or the initiative will be entirely taken over by Trump. Trump, with his peace plan, will essentially overtake you, and you will become completely irrelevant. This is basically, I think, what Orban is warning them of. I think that his warning will not be heeded. What we have seen from the EU, this degree of rigidity, of obstinacy, to me, it means that these people will not learn before it is too late again. And if Trump does get elected, as seems likely now, I think the scenario that Orban has unfolded in this letter to his colleagues, to Charles Michel and others in the EU, may very well unfold. Namely, that Trump basically imposes peace, and the European Union and its leadership will just be left out and have to live with the consequences any which way they can. Or Trump could withdraw support from the Ukrainian leadership in case the Ukrainians don't want to play ball with his plan, in which case the Europeans would be left entirely alone trying to support this war, which would fail very soon as well.
This is very interesting take, Tarik. I was reading this article that you mentioned in the Financial Times, and I also read many of the commentaries on social media platforms. It seems that there is a vertical division now in Europe, and it's mostly between people who selling the delusion and the illusion that Ukraine can win this war and we still can push back the Russian forces from Ukraine. And then you have the camp whose voice is little bit, I would say, the voice of the those who are dropping the drums of the war are louder because they have the mainstream media behind their backs. So they're amplifying these voices that it's possible to defeat Russia. But the definition of defeating Russia is very important here, that they are not telling us what is Russia going to lose this war. And from the Russian side, they're telling the Europeans that our defeat, like means that we are going to lose all these territories, including the Crimea, and which means that we have to go back to the territories of the Russian Federation. And that is the absolute red line for us. And we will engage in different types of warfare if that happens. It's not going to happen, realistically speaking. We see the map of control over Ukraine and we see the fortifications of the Russian forces. That's not possible. So the only possible scenario is to prolong the war. Now we have Trump, we have Orban, and probably the Slovenian prime minister. We have increasing number of politicians talking about the peace platform. But without the United States, there is not going to be peace in Ukraine. Therefore, all this betting now that Trump may come to power to enforce this peace plan, because the rest of the European countries, we're talking about probably 25 countries now, they're all enthusiastic except for 2 for going and increasing and escalating against Russia. And I see it very provocative, and also they're shooting themselves in the leg. This is my opinion. The European officials disagree with it. But we have also in parallel media. And I will screen you this article I was reading today in the Foreign Policy. And this article is very disappointing. But to be honest, it's not really. It's not surprising for me how Orban became Putin's pawn. I summarize a few paragraphs. Among all of Russia's useful idiots, few have sought to make themselves more useful than Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. In a letter to the real EU president, Charles Michel, Orban claimed that Russia was winning the war so hard that it wanted to begin peace talks immediately, the starting point of which would be the permanent occupation of bits of Ukraine that Russian troops haven't even occupied or vaporized yet. The question isn't so much what Orban is doing as much as why he is doing it at all. Hungary is a member of both NATO and the EU. Then, superficially, Orban could be taken for a simple mercenary. Hungary, after all, does seem to get preferential terms on energy imports from Russia. That remains a big deal, especially after Moscow's invasion of Ukraine and the resulting wave of EU and US sanctions on Russian gas and oil exports that has caused spiraling energy prices in Europe. Hungary does rely extensively on Russia for natural gas and even some nuclear power plants, but Orban has not managed to turn vassalage into even the kind of price discount that China enjoys for importing blacklisted Russian energy. Finally, he says it's not that Orban loves Putin, it's that he hates the West. This is the narrative on the foreign policy.
It's this case where somebody who clearly has an extremely primitive mind is trying to write about somebody who clearly has a rather sophisticated mind, right? I mean, this is, if I were Orban and read this, I'd probably be laughing, exactly as I personally am laughing now, because it's so helpless. You see this attempt to go after Orban with anything this rather simple mind can think of. But he can't think of that much, right? Hates the West. Orban doesn't hate the West at all. Orban doesn't hate Russia. He doesn't love Russia. He doesn't love the West either. You know that if there's one thing that is, 2 things I think are genuine about Orban, 2 basic things. One is he's extremely ambitious personally, which is fairly normal for a major politician, right? Yeah. Let's face it, right? The other is that he is a sincere, and here you can use any word you like, I don't care, patriot or nationalist. So the one thing he loves outside himself, and maybe his family, I give him that, is his country. That's probably what it is. And Orban is a leader of a country with less than 10 million people. It's landlocked. It doesn't have many resources at all. It has a highly educated population. They were highly educated in the old Eastern Bloc system. All of this is true, but that's sort of what they have. Right? And what Orban is an extremely apt politician. He's from a different century. We don't make them anymore. He actually has understood, which is not that unusual, that the way forward for a small power like Hungary is to never sell out entirely to one of the blocs. So he has associated himself with the West, which made perfect sense in many ways. NATO gives them certain types of security, even if NATO is a very problematic proposition in other ways. The EU is full of advantages for the Hungarian economy, obviously, and they're absolutely right to take advantage of that as good as they can. But at the same time, Orban maintains agency. When the Ukrainians do it, we call this agency. When the Hungarians do it, we get angry, right?
Yeah.
Hungary actually maintains sovereignty and agency. And this is what you see in this type of behavior. This is exactly what he's doing here. You can construct very complicated legal arguments. I've actually read them. They're amusing. They're highly amusing, of how his trips maybe infringed certain paragraphs in certain EU treaties. But you know what the trap about these arguments is? To make these arguments, you have to tell people that these paragraphs massively restrict national sovereignty deep into foreign policy. Now, you try to pull this one on Orban, right, who is a past master at political rhetoric and give and take. He's going to turn this into cudgel against you, because you've just admitted to him what he has always told people, that the EU is a power-hungry elite that is trying to take away more sovereignty than it is its due from the national governments, and thereby becomes extremely undemocratic, because the EU elites are under even less democratic control than national elites, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is where the problem of sovereignty and the democracy deficit in the EU meet. And it's no accident that one of the ways in which Orban is maligned is as a populist.
Yeah.
And a populist for liberal elites in the United States, but also in Europe, is by now a code word for somebody who actually practices democracy, who actually seeks majorities and thinks that policies have to find majorities in populations to be justified and practiced over time. Now, don't get me wrong. Orban started as some sort of economic liberal when he was very young. He comes from the time of the fall of communism, as we know, right? Started then. He has turned himself into this right-wing figure, into this populist. I admire his brains. I mean, at least he is not an idiot like so many people like Callas and Baerbock. Politically, I have almost nothing in common with him. I'm of the left. I'm a socialist. But the way in which the EU elite tries to deal with him, he actually has the better case. He definitely has the better case. And the danger for democracy and for political participation of actual EU populations, it comes from the EU elite. It does not come from Orban. And so ultimately, on this one, I'm with Orban.
You're mentioning that about democracy and the threat to democracy. According to the foreign policy, this threat is coming from Orban himself. And this is the last paragraph, actually, because before this paragraph, the author was arguing that all the allies of Orban are the right-wingers in Europe, those who are the allies of Putin. And then he says the biggest elephant in the room remains overseas in the United States. Trump and Orban not only have a mind meld, Orban's cancelled speech to the European Parliament was literally titled Make Europe Great Again, but also a tactical cooperation. If Britain was long the beachhead of American transatlanticists, Hungary is the landing zone and inspiration for America's far right. Case in point, Orban will make his way to Mar-a-Lago, Florida, to meet with Trump just after this week's NATO summit, less than a week after checking in with Putin. In spy novels, at least, cutouts are meant to squeeze the connection. Russia has always had its fellow travelers, especially since the Bolshevik Revolution more than a century ago. Some of them were useful idiots peddling the Kremlin's line around the world, while others were more idiots than useful. What is alarming today is that the idiots are becoming, in many cases, pivotal. So,
look,
he's not...
Honestly, where do you find that?
I was reading this in a warm weather. I was started to sweat when I read this article.
Look. I mean, it's amazing because it's so transparent, right? I understand that Orban is a very right-wing figure. So is Donald Trump. You can call them far right if you wish. But here's the problem. at this point, Orban has won elections, right? He has to an extent manipulated, for instance, the Hungarian legal system. I'm well aware of that. He's to an extent manipulated the Hungarian media. Now, that is, frankly, what is happening in every state I can think of. It's just in Orban's case, they're picking on it. There are no better democracies. Orban has had the temerity to actually give his special type of democracy a name, and he's called it illiberal democracy, right? Now, illiberal democracy, to me, it's neither here nor there. You know, if you read Rousseau, perhaps the greatest theorist of actual democracy, nobody likes him because it's so uncompromising. It's very illiberal, because liberalism and democracy are not at all the same thing, and they do not automatically converge. And one of the things that Orban has done in his career, and that these people hate so much, is he has dwelt on this point. He's a very smart guy, and he's completely understood this point. Liberalism is not automatically democratic. Liberalism, when it emerged in the 19th century, was deeply undemocratic. And when you pursue its history, it only learns to live with democracy. And what we now have is this uneasy compromise between liberalism and democracy in many states in the West. And actually, the pendulum is swinging back. We are now seeing a lot of liberalism becoming very undemocratic again. So when somebody like Orban says illiberal democracy, I neither welcome it nor does it frighten me, because I don't see liberalism as helping democracy very much at all, quite the opposite. So that is the fundamental point. But the other one is, of course, if they complain, as in this article, that there is now a special relationship coming about between American ultra-conservatives like Trump and Hungarian ultra-conservatives, it's another word, like Orban. Well, you know what? We've had that special relationship between the liberals in America and Poland. We've had it between the liberals in America and the Baltics. We've had it between the liberals in America and for a long time Britain. And before that, in the good old Cold War, it was West Germany. There were always these special relationships, and they were always politicized by political camp. So now to start crying and say, oh my God, the other side is going to have their favorites as well. Well, yeah, if you don't like that, you should have been against this type of system much, much earlier.
Yes.
Now, I will tell you where Trump actually really worries me is a totally different region. It's the Middle East.
Yes.
Concerning Europe, Trump does not worry me. Concerning Europe, I see potential for improvement. But concerning the Middle East, you know what? I will not say it can get worse, because I think Ali Abunimah is absolutely right. We are seeing the Americans under Democrats participating and committing a genocide together with the Israelis. It doesn't get worse than genocide, literally, right? But if you listen to, for instance, the speech that J.D. Vance, Trump's prospective vice president, has just given, it's all about Iran, Iran, Iran again, right? And I hope they're not serious about it. So again, I can see Trump as a great danger internationally in two regions, the Middle East most of all, and secondly, China and everything Asian around it. I think that Trump for Europe might actually be good, even if they don't understand it, because he will force the insane European elites to get off the bloody war path, finally.
It's just a matter of priorities at the moment. Like, it's not like Trump is an anti-war candidate. His priorities are different. He wants to contain China and he wants to destroy Iran. The Democrats are focusing more on the Russian side now. They realize that this was probably a strategic miscalculation, so they want to push the Europeans to deal with Russia, so that they get more periphery and more they focus on China in this case. Before moving to this Trump case, because I'm going to ask you about this, we have another personality that I'm sure that you like her a lot, Kaja Kallas. Kaja became the top diplomat in the EU, and according to the German Deutsche Welle website, she has a brilliant program for the EU in the future. But when I read in between the lines, it's all about war. So Kallas, she is 47, was one of the first EU leaders to sound the alarm about Putin's expansionist designs, warning colleagues against falling into the trap of believing good trade relations with Moscow could avert the crisis that Europe later found itself in when Russia invaded Ukraine. Kallas' credentials and instincts seem to have turned into assets as the EU decided to step out of its comfort zone and prepare against the Russian threat. Some are even mulling whether to bring back military conscription. Several experts told Deutsche Welle that Kallas is the right pick at the right time in terms of foreign policy, mostly because over the next 5 years, the EU's focus will be on strengthening defenses against Russia. Her top priority as the EU's chief diplomat will be ensuring that Europeans are prepared to prevent future Russian advances. The war in Ukraine has exposed many of Europe's vulnerabilities, including inadequate ammunition production and gaps in satellite-based surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities. Kallas has suggested joint borrowing by the EU to fund the expansion of defense capabilities. Like when you go through all the article, they're only speaking about military aspects of her. It really strikes me because she is in the position of the EU's top diplomat. Like it's war rhetoric coming from a diplomat. Like really, the concepts have been really confused nowadays in the European
completely
Union.
Perverted. Completely intellectually perverted, right? I was thinking exactly the same thing when you read this. I hadn't seen this article, but it's really striking because when you read this out, what it describes, right, at best, are the duties of a minister of defense, right? If this was a minister of defense, you would say, oh yeah, that's their job, right? Always thinking about the worst case in military terms, being prepared, blah, blah, blah. You can agree, you cannot agree, but it's their job, right? But this is the diplomat. The chief diplomat, right? You're absolutely right. So they don't even see anymore that the job of the chief diplomat should be to try to resolve the crises by non-military means, right? The job of the Minister of Defense is to prepare for the case that your crisis gets out of control and you have to fight. But this is always the last possible solution, right?
Yeah.
Before that happens, you are supposed to have a foreign policy that tries to either completely resolve the crisis to mutual benefit, right? The good old diplomacy, or at least to sort of contain it so that you can live with each other without fighting. And there's this spirit now in the EU. It's not just this article that has completely forgotten that. The task of diplomacy is to engage in war rhetoric. We see this very much with Annalena Baerbock too. Complete anti-diplomat. There's nothing diplomatic, literally, about her. She doesn't know what diplomacy is about. All she knows is about giving speeches that finger the other as something horribly evil that must be fought. That's all she does. She's a preacher, but a very bad one. And Kallas is a very similar format. She is intellectually clearly out of her depths. She is... I don't want to call her stupid, but she gives a good impression of not being very bright. And she has no idea, she has no interest in any sort of negotiation, compromise, even a very aggressive compromise. You know, you can have a foreign policy that seeks compromise, but is very selfish. That's a possibility. It's been done very often. If you think, for instance, I'll give you an example. How did the old Cold War end? It ended for two reasons, because the Russians or the Soviets under Mikhail Gorbachev initiated the end. They were the first ones to say, look, let's not do this anymore. And then the Americans under Reagan took advantage. They could just have said no, but instead they took advantage and they said, yes, let's do this. And when you look at what happens in the later 1980s is they come to compromise, but if you study it carefully, you see that it's a much better compromise for the Americans than for the Soviets, which in a way you can understand because the Soviets were much weaker. So reality expressed itself in this compromise. And I'm still glad that both sides did it. But on what you see there on the American side is a foreign policy ready to negotiate while taking advantage. That's not very nice, but at least it's ready to negotiate. We don't even have this anymore. We are more primitive and more aggressive than Ronald Reagan now in the European Union. I mean this literally. And this is how we get to people like Kaja Kallas. Now, if this war ends in Ukraine, and when it ends, colors will, of course, turn into enormous liability, because how do you actually adjust Europe's foreign policy to the war finally ending if the Europeans want it or not? With somebody like Callas, all she could do is basically jump out of the window, right? Because she will be in the totally wrong place. She would basically have to resign and be replaced. But since she's a very ambitious person as well, she will probably not do this. So there's a problem in the making. And one last point I wanted to mention, this article repeats this idiotic, I've so had it with this idiotic line that somehow there's a connection between the Europeans having commercial relationships with Russia before all of this went down and this happening. This is nonsense. This is not why this happened. This is not why this happened. This happened because we expanded NATO. And the Russians were very clear about this. The Russians didn't come and say, you know what, we don't like the commercial relationship. They actually liked it. And if you don't stop, we're going to make war on you. They said in December 2021, they said it to us in 2 draft treaties, stop expanding NATO, drop Ukraine, or something is going to happen. That's the reason why we are in this indirect war with them, not because we traded with them. In fact, in a normal world, we should go back to trading with them, which is very, very normal, because states and societies can trade with each other, even if in foreign policy terms, they're slightly antagonistic. That's perfectly okay. One can actually manage this. Prime example, China and the USA. How does it come that China and the USA, even now, after the US is trying to push it back, are such enormous trade partners, although they are allegedly also in the new Cold War with each other? Because the trade doesn't cause the problems. If anything, the trade mitigates the problems. And it's idiots like Callas who go after this very peaceful aspect of relationship between societies because they want conflict.
Guys, what Tarik mentioned about December 2021, this was the draft security deal that Russia sent to the US for a comprehensive security architecture for Eastern Europe, and the Biden administration ridiculed the offer of Russia. They didn't take their time to look into it, and the response was very, very quick. Like they didn't have time to read the papers, and they ridiculed it. And then they realized in January that when the Russian forces were massing on the borders, they started showing us the satellite images that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. So this was the direct correlation between the Russian invasion of Ukraine and why they invaded Ukraine in this case and captured these territories. And this is directly related to the NATO expansion to the east, to the borders of Russia. Before we continue this with the Trump's nomination, he nominated the vice president. I can see some of the comments asking where I have been. If you haven't watched yesterday's live streaming, guys, I had to go for an emergency family situation for 3 weeks, so I couldn't post any live streamings. I announced it before I left, and I also announced it when I came back in yesterday's live streaming. Also, for those who are looking to read the writings of Tarik, the brilliant articles that he posts, the links for his articles on Substack is in the description below, and also his X account is in the description below, guys. Tarik, now we have Trump coming, and he nominated he shared his vice president for the position of the vice president. And I asked the artificial intelligence to tell me who is JD Vance. Just for everyone to know, this is the artificial intelligence of Brave browser. So just quickly, guys, on July, in July 2024, Donald Trump announced his vice president picked JD Vance, a junior senator from Ohio and author of the best-selling memoir, Hillbilly Elegy. Vance, a venture capitalist and former Marine, has undergone a significant transformation from being a vocal critic of Trump to becoming a fierce defender of the former president. Vance was born in 84, so he is only 3 years older than me, in Middletown, Ohio, and grew up in a working class family. He served in the U.S. Marine Corps from 2003 to 2007 and later attended Ohio State University and Yale Law School. Vance's memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, was published in 2016 and became a bestseller detailing his upbringing and experiences with poverty and drug addiction. Political career. Vance was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2022, winning a crowded Republican primary with Trump's endorsement. As a senator, Vance has been a vocal supporter of Trump's policies, including his stance on immigration and trade. Trump's choice. Trump selected Vance as his running mate, citing his loyalty and commitment to his agenda. Vance has been a key figure in Trump's campaign, serving as a surrogate and speaking at rallies. Reactions. The Biden campaign responded to the announcement criticizing Vance for his previous comments on election fraud and his willingness to enable Trump's extreme agenda. The pick has been met with mixed reactions from Republicans, with some praising Vance's loyalty to Trump and others expressing concerns about his lack of experience in national politics. Now, what we really care about is the foreign policy. At this point, does a person like him has, let's say, an influence over Trump's choices, for example, when it comes to Ukraine? Since we're speaking about Ukraine, this is the first thing, because I saw lots of panic from the pro-Ukrainian camp for this selection, let's say, and also the most probably Trump is going to become a president. And so does he have any influence over Trump? And why the pro-Ukraine camp, the NAFO trolls, are very paranoid now about this case?
Yeah, I don't understand why they are particularly excited or afraid of Vance, because to me it seems that Trump's takes on particularly the war in Ukraine, on how to relate to Russia, this is also in the background, on how to relate to Putin, this is important, and finally on NATO, right? All of these things are important if you look at this from Kiev. And these takes on Trump's side, they have been in the making for years, since his first time in office at least. And from what I can see, and I want to do much more reading on this, I'm obviously a little bit behind, but from what I can see, there is like a whole ecosystem now of various types of think tanks and experts and people who are sort of closer to him and a little farther away from him, and who sort of detail his intuition for him. I think this is what is really happening, right? He does set the tone. I mean, think about what sort of personality Trump is. Trump is not somebody who lets somebody else shape the agenda. He's power hungry. And I mean this in a neutral way, right? Everybody who wants an office like this is power hungry to some extent. But Trump is very much his own man. And unlike Biden, he doesn't suffer from dementia. They are actually not that far apart in terms of age, not that far, but it is true that Trump is clearly in much better health, mentally as well. So Trump, I don't think that Vance is something that people who want this war in Ukraine to continue, which is a horrifically bad idea anyhow, should worry about too much. I think the real problem is Trump. Trump himself has ideas that don't work well, that don't work at all if he implements them, with the US continuing supporting this war, right? And we've talked about this at the beginning. He's been very explicit about this. The one thing I could say about Vance in this respect is that Vance will certainly not push him in another direction, even if he could. That's not coming from there. I don't think that's coming from anybody. So, the sort of Eisenhowerian, to use a very old time, sort of internationalist Cold War Republican wing doesn't have any power anymore. And it certainly doesn't have any power with Trump. Trump stands, remember his old slogan, which he resurrected it from history. But Trump's old slogan was America First, apart from Make America Great Again. And America First, as you know, initially was a problematic isolationist slogan. Trump knew what he was doing when he was resurrecting it. He wanted to signal to people America first in terms of foreign policy. And one of the consequences of that is that he will only opt for conflict where he thinks conflict is useful for America. And he may very well be wrong about those things too. But I don't think, I'm actually sure that Trump does not believe that conflict with Russia is useful for America. That's the core issue. Trump believes America doesn't need conflict with Russia. And he's absolutely right about this, actually. America doesn't need a conflict with Russia. And there's absolutely no sane reason to have such a conflict over Ukraine. And I think he will implement that whoever his vice president is going to be, Vance or somebody else.
Yeah. In this case, Vance's statements about China is also interesting. I watched a video of him on Fox News Sunday, and he supported first of all, unconditionally arming Israel and encircling China. He argues that the EU should be made to dump more money into Ukraine, here echoing Trump's view, so that the US can focus on preparing for war with China. Then I watched him speaking I think this was in the House or in the Senate. He said, quote, "The Chinese have a foreign policy of building roads and bridges and feeding the poor."
This is very evil.
Yeah, I mean,
how dare they?
Those are two contradictory statements from his side. If the Russian foreign policy is based on building roads and infrastructure, why would the United States want to encircle China?
Chinese, yeah. Well, because we know the reason. The reason is the old reason, which is that the United States elite, and in this respect, they still all think the same way, does not want to allow a regional hegemon to arise anywhere on the globe, literally. It's insane, but that's their policy. But it's not about, we've talked about this before, it's not about the fact that they feel challenged for primacy. They do that too, but that isn't their most acute problem. The most acute problem is that they don't want any power to have like a region around it on the globe that they can use as a resource to challenge them or to resist them. And especially not in Eurasia. But what the United States is overlooking is that they're pushing the Russians and the Chinese together. They've done this enormously. You've recently seen it as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in Astana in Kazakhstan. Yeah. And if the Chinese and the Russians stay together, then the United States will not get a foot on the ground in Eurasia again. This game will be over if they stay together. And I think one of the games that some people, maybe Vance, maybe some others, are already thinking about is doing a reverse Kissinger, where they want to rebuild relationships with the Russians and then split the Russians off the Chinese, the way that Kissinger and Nixon used the Chinese against the Soviets in the old Cold War. But my guess is that Beijing and Moscow really know this sort of routine now, and they won't fall for it. They'd be very, very stupid. Because American power in Eurasia only functions if they can divide these two. If America cannot divide the Russians from the Chinese, they will not prevail in Eurasia. This whole thing is not going to work.
I think it's too late now to draw a division between Russia and China in this case. There are many layers of the relationship between China and Russia. We're speaking about grand strategy. Both sides have become mature enough to understand the mentality, let's say, or the strategy behind these foreign policies of the US in Eurasia. Secondly, the high level of economic and energy deals among each other. Three, mutual interests in many of the regions, especially, for example, in the Middle East, stabilizing the region and investing in this region and making profits mutually. And three, this was traditionally, it was important, like the chemistry between leaders, and you can see that these two leaders trust each other, and how do they treat each other and speak between each other, something that you miss in Europe or in the United States, to see two gentlemen, like really, like there is a gentleman agreement, no, in the West now, even if you sign it and submit it in the UN Security Council, they could just tear it apart,
But this is how we've approached the Russians when the Russians started rightly saying, you promised us no NATO expansion. One of our arguments was why we never put that into a treaty. I mean, where's good faith? If you talk to people like that, then you shouldn't be astonished that they become your enemies. And the Russians developed a term for that. They called it nedogovorospodobny, which means not capable of agreement. By which they mean, if you're dealing with a person where you know their word doesn't count, that's what that means. And this is exactly what we have become to them. And many other states and statesmen, and you're absolutely right about this, still are like that with each other. They still have a degree of good faith. And there's one other thing that I would add to what we were talking about, which is when Washington in the 70s, right, managed to mobilize to an extent the Chinese against the Soviets, there was something between the Soviets and the Chinese that was unresolved, which was a struggle over primacy in what they saw as like the communist camp or something, right? Who is the biggest communist power? Now, when you look at Russia and China now, they are not struggling. They're far too smart. It is true that in some ways, Russia is actually junior power now, and China is the senior power. But look at the picture. They are not fighting over this. The Chinese are smart enough, they're wise enough not to be oppressive, not to sort of play their cards too hard. And the Russians are smart enough to actually live with this and work with it. And they're not fighting over this, and they're not fighting over some sort of primacy in Eurasia either. There are these Western fantasies. Whenever there is a crisis somewhere in Central Asia, right? You know this too. Somebody writes in Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy, now the Chinese and the Russians are going to come to blows, blah, blah, blah. Nothing, nada. They're far too smart for this. They also have learned. And another thing they've learned, and I think you've already said this, but let me just underline it, is, look, the Americans have playing their games now for decades and decades. Do they not understand that most people in the world now understand how they work? The Americans are not that original. I mean, the way they cheat, the way they use power, the way they use coups, the way they subvert, it's always the same. And by now, all of this is old. And the Russians and the Chinese look at this and know they're not going to fall for your shit again.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. I mentioned this after October 7, how especially the Western media is powerful when it comes to imposing a narrative and making people believe in a narrative. But they're powerful, but they're not creative. And similarly, in the political structures, their arguments are repetitive. They're not really outstanding in finding new arguments to convince the people. And this comes also to the journalists. And this is just a personal experience of mine. For 13 years, I've been involved in the Syrian case. I've been covering it extensively, and I've been smeared by mainstream journalists calling me all sorts of names. And these same journalists, for example, when they want to visit Berlin, they send me an email. They want to meet me. They come here, like seriously, like they write shit about me, and then they want to meet me. And I'm like, okay, let's meet for a coffee. And I tell them this is not recorded. You cannot report about it. But what I find is astonishing for me is how they treat me like I'm an idiot, because they truly come and tell me, but Kevork, do you really believe in what you say about the Syrian case? Like, don't you see that you are like making false reporting or allegations about the Syrian case? And I'm like, I have to ask you the same question. For me, you're the one who is a non-Syrian. You're truly reporting 180-degree opposite of the reality on the ground in some cases. And you come to me and you have the audacity to tell me that, like, it's like this attitude, do you really believe in what you say, Kevork? Come on, man. Do you want to really convince me that you don't know the truth? Like, don't treat me like I'm an idiot, or just get my information from somewhere and I parrot it.
But Kevork, what you're talking about, I think, right, to me, and what we are talking about, I don't want to overgeneralize, but there is like a pervasive arrogance in the West.
Yes.
And it's in politics, it's in the media, it's in the cultural elites. And what's so strange about this arrogance, it's not that strange actually, it's very classic, is that it makes those who are arrogant also fairly stupid. And this is what you're describing. You're countering people who say such bizarre things that you can hardly believe that they can actually not stop themselves. Right? Again, let's go to Kaja Kallas. This woman who's supposed to be de facto the foreign minister of the EU, right, where she will look after weapons most of all, apparently. She actually was at a conference, I think we talked about this before, just 2 months or so ago in Estonia, and she was in front of a camera, right? This is what I found so astonishing. And she goes on like a little schoolgirl, and she's like,
oh, you know, what's so bad if Russia falls apart? If there are a lot of states instead of just one big Russia, then all of these different states can be sovereign like an idiot, right? And the point is not only that she's too dumb to understand that making a state with about 1,500 live nuclear weapons and then about 2,500 in additional storage fall apart is generally a really dumb idea. The thing is, she doesn't even know it's a dumb idea to say this on camera. Yes. But then again, fast forward, right? Then we learn that in nowadays EU, this does not disqualify you to become the foreign minister of the whole thing. Right? So now we've learned that maybe Callas is smarter than we think, because she has understood how stupid you have to sound to get the top job. Right?
She found the key for this type of job. Like the vice president of the US, the current one, Kamala Harris, she said when she wanted to explain the Ukraine war, so there is a big country and called Russia, and there is a smaller country called Ukraine, and the bigger country woke up in the morning and decided to attack the smaller country, and that's bad.
Isn't that a description of half of American history, actually?
Yeah.
A big country attacking a small country? We didn't realize, right?
No. There is no self-reflection at all. Tarik, what an amazing chat with you today. Really, thank you so much for coming to Syriana Analysis again. Guys, his X account and his Substack are in the description below. I really appreciate you, Tarik, for coming and dedicating this time and having this chat with me. And guys, really, thank you so much. Amir, thank you for tuning in, my friend, for this live streaming. Guys, if you like this video, hit the like button, share it with your friends. And if you like to support the independent work I'm doing, you can become a patron. The link is scrolling on the screen, patreon.com/Syriana Analysis. And I will see you tomorrow, Wednesday, 5 p.m. Central European Time, 11 a.m. Eastern American Time. Peace be upon you, upon your families, and salam.
Bye-bye.